Good evening. It's a real pleasure to welcome all of you here to These Are Our Stories lecture series. Special thanks to the First Bank of Alabama for sponsoring this series. Please, if you see Chad Jones, tell him what a wonderful thing they've done in sponsoring this, and we will allow him to continue that program, so just see what you can do. We're real thrilled today to have a revisit from Dr. Braund for the Battle of Horseshoe Bend after she analyzed a collection of 12 maps of the Horseshoe Bend battleground, and maps of which were drawn by the soldiers long after the battle was over. And as you know, anytime you think about Indians and the history, you think about Dr. Braund and her program and the number of students she's had. But you know, she's a graduate of Auburn, got her doctorate at Florida State, and she has focused on the 18th and 19th century and the history of Indians in this country, in the Southeast anyway. And she's had all sorts of books, the deerskins and duffels, the Creek Indian trade with Americans, and many other books. But the main thing we've got is we've got the authority on American Indians, Southeastern Indians, and something that will change your mind about what you thought you knew. So, Dr. Braund, welcome to Sylacauga, and let's give her a warm welcome. This is about 10. Questions.
Thank you. It's so great to be here again in Sylacauga. I've been several times, and you are all so lucky to have this library and the public services it provides for the community. So thank you, Ted, for that introduction, which was a little over the top, but hey, okay, I'll take it. I am here to talk about the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in a kind of a roundabout way. How many of you have been to Horseshoe Bend National Military Park? Right. Oh, a few people's hands aren't up. Okay, here's your assignment. If you haven't been, you need to go, and if you have been, you need to go again. And so most of you will know that the battle that occurred not far from here on March 27, 1814, was the largest and last battle of the Creek Indian War. And that was a war of very complicated causes, which I won't get into at this very minute, but it broke out in the summer of 1813, and the result was it was a civil war between segments of the Creek Indian Nation. One segment, the Red Stick Creeks, literally raised the symbolic red stick of war to declare war against their own leadership. And that civil war spilled over into a war that came to involve America. In fact, after the attack of the Red Sticks on Fort Mims, that involved not only an attack on Creeks who were there, but Mississippi Territorial Militia. The state of Tennessee declared that due to the invasion of the Indians, they were going to go to war. I'm having trouble with my little thing. Can y'all hear? Okay. In any case, it was a war that began in an all-out invasion. Troops from Mississippi came east, troops from Georgia west, and the Tennesseans came down from the north, and they are the ones who converged at what we know as Horseshoe Bend. That's the Horseshoe Bend, a horseshoe-shaped bend in the Tallapoosa River, known at the time, the translation was Horse's Flatfoot, that's what the Americans called it, and better known as Topeka, which is a Muskogean word meaning fortification. And it was there that Native people from about 6, probably more towns, have built an enormous barricade across the neck of that river bend, and were providing security, they thought, for a refugee village there. It was a very terrible day for the Red Sticks who were gathered there, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. as we get to it, and I'll use some of these little maps. So let me tell you about the maps. When I first started studying this war many years ago, the park ranger at Horseshoe Bend had a grant, and he got me to start looking for documents and maps to help them better interpret the site. And at that time, there were 3 really well-known maps of the site that were used by historians and archaeologists, not only at the park, but indeed across the spectrum, to look at this battle. And I must say, at that time, historians were mainly using these maps as nice illustrations. You know, they were shrunk down; you really couldn't figure the details. But I want to show you those maps. One of them is this map. This is the so-called Tarrant map. It is housed at the Alabama Department of Archives and History. And here's a better shot of it, a little better. And you can't really see it, but at the time, when we first started looking at these things, it was known as the coffee map. And I couldn't figure it out. As a historian, you want to know who drew the map, how did it get to the Alabama archives? In other words, what's its provenance? Is it legitimate? And so when we look at this, and I was telling that ranger, whose name was O.V. Jensen, I said, why do you think this is called a coffee map? Because the title really would be, down here at the bottom, we have a date, which I'm sure is too hard for you to read. It doesn't say anything about John Coffey producing this map. And his answer was pretty glib, but probably right. And he said, well, it's probably because Coffey's name's on it a couple of times. And John Coffey is a pretty important figure in early Alabama history. And it has on the map where Coffey crossed the river, where Coffey's troops went around, literally around the bend. And that is indeed what happened in the battle. And the other map was equally intriguing, and it was the so-called Jackson map, the map drawn by Andrew Jackson, all right? The great hero of the battle, the American commander who led 3,000 troops down there to the battlefield. Well, the problem is that's not Andrew Jackson's handwriting, and that had a sort of a shady past too, and it sort of, I found through a lot of research, came together and then was folded in with his report and presented to the Tennessee Historical Society after a lot of research. So we have a Jackson map that wasn't drawn by Jackson, and you see here we still have the Horseshoe Bend shape of the river, and if you look hard, you can see the barricade. And then there was this map, the Cheatham map. Colonel John Cheatham was the topographical engineer that day. He was a very green topographical engineer. He obviously had some surveying skill. He was 23 years old the day of the battle, and he'd just been promoted because everybody above him had resigned. And he produced the only official battle map, the one, he was the official map for the Army and so forth. And so this is his map, but the one that the park held was not exactly this map. It was found in the William Henry Harrison papers, later president and so forth. But William Henry Harrison didn't have anything to do with the war, with the Creek War, and I thought, why is the official map of Horseshoe Bend in Harrison's papers? And it turns out it was a copy of that map sent by the man who was in charge of the artillery. So the more I started digging into these maps and trying to pin them down, which is what historians want to do, you want authentic material, it became very important to me to make sure these maps were right. And there was one other map known at the time, and this one was one well known to Alabama archaeologists who were working on Fort Toulouse, Fort Jackson over near Wetumpka. Any of you been over there? Right, okay. Well, they had used General Graham was the commander after the war at the new Fort Jackson. And so this map was in his papers, and this was a map that they had uncovered when they were working there. And so if you look up at the top, you probably can't read it, so I'm going to read it for you. It says, Battle of Horseshoe, fought 27 March 1814, as sketched by Colonel Graham, now General Graham, a few days after the battle. Well, y'all, if General Graham had drawn that map, that's not how he would sign it. So that's clearly a copy of his map. And so the historian, and frankly the geographer in me, wanted to boil these down. So I started straightening these out and went on to other things, including collecting a lot of documents. And as I moved on from that and had finished my report for the park, I kept finding more and more of these little maps. And they are little maps. They're pocket-sized map, just a piece of note paper, most of them this size, that the men who drew them could fold them up, put them in a letter, and send them home. In the end, I found about 12 of these things. And I didn't find them all at once. I'd find one here, a year later, one would pop up there. And the bicentennial of the War of 1812, and in the aftermath, was very helpful because archivists and librarians started digging around in their collections for things associated with the war, and more of them came online. And so I had this whole body of these little maps, and it puzzled me because no other Creek War battle has that many maps. In fact, most of the Creek War battles don't have any maps or just one map. And even in the War of 1812, like the Battle of New Orleans, they didn't produce, this many soldier maps. So I began to search around and try to, understand what I could learn from these maps. And some of them I found very powerful. There is this map. This has to be one of the ugliest maps that you can imagine. It was drawn by another, I think he was probably 23 too, another very young man, Robert Houston McEwen. He was a cousin of Sam Houston, who is very famous and who was also at the battle. His mother was Sam Houston's aunt. And if you know anything about the battle, Sam Houston was wounded at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, and when they carried Houston back to Tennessee, he stopped at his aunt's house for recovery and so forth. Well, young Robert valued this map tremendously. He wrote what he called memorandum on the map. He wrote it 3 different times, and he carried it his whole life in his possession. It fell into the possession of his wife after his death, then his daughter, and finally for his grandson, who gave it to the Library of Congress. And it's 18 by 13 inches, like I say, roughly the size of a piece of paper. And the more I looked at it, because when I first found it, I thought, ooh, another map. But the more I looked at it, the more amazing and personal and powerful it became to me, and gave me a new way to think about the Creek War. And I'm going to read you that little memorandum from you. For what I'm reading you is on the right side of that map, all that scrunched up handwriting over there. And he says, I drew this description of the battleground and made my memorandums on my hat the morning after the battle. All right. If you are aware of the uniforms of the soldiers of the day, you'll know they had pretty tall hats that had a flat top. So you think about this. Here is a young man the day after a battle. There are, by a very good count, 557 dead Red Sticks on the battlefield. The barricade that they had built is on fire. There are numerous American wounded. They're making litters to carry them home. There are groans and moans of these wounded men. There are imprisoned women and children. There are hundreds of dead Red Sticks, uncounted, floating in the river around the bend. It's a bizarre and awkward scene. And here's this 23-year-old man sitting there drawing a map using the top of his hat for a drawing surface, a writing surface. And he says, the battle commenced about 10 o'clock a.m. and ended about sundown. It literally was a battle that lasted the entire day. I was regimental quartermaster to a regiment of 6-month volunteers from East Tennessee, commanded by Colonel John Brown, those famous Tennessee volunteers. We left Kingston, East Tennessee, the 23rd January 1814 for the Creek Nation, and returned to Kingston the 9th May 1814, the war with the Indians being at an end. My colonel being sick, I had a high command on the day of the battle, signed R.H. McEwen. And then he goes on the other side of the thing, up on the left side, and he writes some more. He said, being a quartermaster to a regiment, I was entitled to carry a sword. And this is very important because he is a man of status. He is an officer. You can carry a sword. And then he wrote, this I scorned to do. I went to fight. I therefore carried a large rifle the whole route. R.H. McEwen. And so here is a man who tells you a lot about himself. He came to fight, he did fight, and he is drawing in what must have been some post-traumatic stress kind of way, this description of the battleground. He doesn't say, and here's what I did on the day. What he does is he shows the ground he fought on and where components of the army was. And the most important thing from that is that in his representation of the breastwork, which you see there looks like a little triangle, that dark thing in the middle, looks actually nothing like these others. And that's one of the things scholars would most dearly like to know, exactly what that barricade looked like. But he provides new information that no official report or letter does. And one of his little, in his, down at the bottom, where he's writing what he's numbered things, and figure 2 says, that is the sally port, which was a small avenue through which a man could just pass. A sally port. That's the only mention, or the first mention I had seen of that. Not in the other ones. We have this image of Horseshoe Bend after 2 hours of cannonading, which was entirely ineffective. The Cherokees managed to cross the river at the end of the bend and set the village on fire. And at that point, the 39th Regiment, the U.S., the regulars, were sent in a charge of the barricade. And we have these incredible pictures of men scrambling over the top of what was a 5 to 6, some accounts say even 8-foot barricade to get over to fight the Red Sticks. But here is a man on the ground. Remember, he carried a rifle. He meant to fight. He went in, and he went in not simply all of them over the barricade, but they found a sally port, and that is one of the ways in which the Army managed to get through. Probably the 39th hit the wall and climbed over, and the militia that followed them managed to get into the sally port. So that was an incredible finding when I started considering this, and really provides new information for us to talk about the battle and think about the battle. Because obviously it would make sense that there be some port there. And then there was this map in the Gilda Lehrman collection. It came to light very late, again in the aftermath of the bicentennial of the War of 1812, and you see the same thing. There's the sally port. You also see some forward positions clearly marked. Someone asked me, let me see if I can get this to... I can't get them, but you see these little things. One lady asked me, she said, what are those crosses? Do you see those down there? Those are little cannons. Those are the 2 cannons that Jackson had. They're anti-personnel. They just didn't do anything against that big wall, which was big pines that had been erected and so forth. And you notice this map was included in a letter to Henry Mackay on May 12th. Remember, the guys got back to Tennessee the 9th, and that's when they started sending the letters home, most of them. Jackson had actually sent his reports and letters from the battlefield the day after the battle. But the men who were sending letters home to their fathers, their wives, their cousins and brothers, those letters began to filter in early May. And again, the man on the ground, and I'm not sure if Stevens produced this map, but he certainly had information about it, and this is a beautifully drawn little map, and you can see it's damaged through time and so forth, but still in really good shape. And we'll come back to this one because you see at the toe of the bend, he actually numbers 300 houses. So these maps began to really give me a different idea and picture of the battle with new information I had not seen. And I began to gather them together and think about ways, now what have I done, to get these things going. Okay, where's the... here we go. And this is one of my, I see what I'm doing. I'm going the wrong way. This is one of my, favorite maps. This was by an unknown artist, and it's one of the reasons we need good librarians and archivists, because it had been in the University of Tennessee Special Collections under the heading Ray County, Tennessee. And no one looking for information on the Creek War does a search on Ray County, Tennessee to find information about the battle. But what it was, this letter was mailed to someone in Ray County, Tennessee, and got in that collection. So they managed to work it out. But again, if you can see well enough, you'll see here again a little avenue or sally port that this man has drawn. And up at the top, red sticks running. Well, they weren't running, they were slowly retreating, and they were retreating from about noon when the assault on the barricade started until the sun set, and as Jackson said, nearly every man on the field was dead. I mean, the Americans, the aim was to end the opposition to the war, and the way to do that, in their view, was to destroy the enemy. This was made more difficult by the many fallback positions described in the letters and documented on the maps that the Red Stick defenders had produced. Not only forward-facing entrenchments in front of that big wall, but behind it. And so as the American troops went through, there were dugout areas that were covered with timber. There were what some Americans called caves along the side. So it was a brutal, brutal afternoon. And as the officers wrote in their reports, it was very difficult because the Red Sticks refused to surrender, even, as one officer wrote, with a sword at their breast, and given the chance, they would not surrender. They fought to the last man. If they couldn't get to the river and escape, they fought to the end. And so these maps provide really incredible testimony and new information about the battle and new ways to think about it. Not just that, I get so tired of reading books. It says, you know, Andrew Jackson did this, Andrew Jackson did that. No, he had 3,000 men in an army. Let's talk about what the individuals in that army did, what the other side was doing. Let's be more holistic in our approach to these battle stories. And so along the lines of this, and you see how this thing was folded, you see the holes in it and whatever, let me make a plea to you. Please donate your family papers. The top here is on the back of that map. It's some young child who's done penmanship practice, like 1, 2, 3, 4. He's got a saying about George Washington, and it completely obscures the letter. So, and it really, you know, it finally ended up in the archives, but so many collections are missing from our record because they were left to families. And I'll just throw in one because I'm just taking too much time on this. But anyway, John Crowell, who was the Indian agent, he had no children. His family inherited his papers, and it's pretty clear that grandchildren, great-grandchildren, used those as coloring books and so forth. And so we have virtually none of his private papers, only the ones that went to the government. So donate your papers. And the thing at the letter is a photocopy of a letter by a man who is writing his wife, Dear Francie. And he writes this letter and he tells her about their mutual friends who either survived the battle or were injured. And then he says, I'm enclosing a plan of the bend of the river together with the fortifications. In other words, he sent her a map, and I can't find that map. And maybe it's out there somewhere, maybe it's not. But there are many more maps than the ones I found, because I also found references to maps that I couldn't find. So there are plenty of them out there. And that was really the thing that got me going. Why did all these guys draw these maps? They didn't do it at other battles. What was it? Aside from the fact, obviously, it's easy to draw a river bend and a barricade, but as you see, there are a lot of details on some of these. And so what I did, and this is another one that we don't know where this one is, the gentleman who owned this map simply came to the Tennessee State Archives one day I think in the 1970s, and they have a rough photocopy on an old photocopy machine, and that was his family, so let's hope eventually that ends up somewhere. So what I really did, I decided to do a book, and I didn't want to do a scholarly article for a journal. I wanted it to be a book that average people could read and hold and see these maps and study the maps for themselves. And what I do is analyze the maps and who their makers were. Exactly who were these men? What was their rank? How did these maps get from point A to point B? And I also wanted to discuss the maps and how they can interpret the barricade and change our understanding of the battle, because frankly, we've done about as much archaeology as can be done at the site. Archaeology is expensive. It's also disturbs the ground, and we've reached the limits of what modern archaeology will do. And also what modern funding can do. So maybe one day in the future there'll be archaeology, but until then, we have to rely on documents and maps. And I thought these were very important, because one of the things you want when people go to a historic site is to have it interpreted in a way that's meaningful to them and meaningful to the participants of the time, to tell the story correctly and powerfully. I also came to realize that the reason there were so many maps is that they really were war memorials. These men who had participated in this battle knew it was something incredibly important. They had been part of a large army. They had achieved astounding success in the Creek War, and even though the Creek War is not part of the War of 1812, it happened in conjunction with the War of 1812, and America didn't have a lot of success in the War of 1812 by the time this battle took place. And in fact, it's this battle that elevated Andrew Jackson to the head of the army that went to New Orleans. So if you think it's a good thing we won the Battle of New Orleans, you can thank the outcome of this battle for that. But these maps became very important to the men, and for years after the battle, they would meet annually to have a commemorative event of their own. And I'm sure that's when the maps came out and the stories were told, and boy, I wish I could go to one of those. I wish somebody had been taking minutes. But I look at the ways in which the maps memorialize heroism and sacrifice, because none of them have an exit say, I was here. They're all about the Army. Here's the cannon crew. Here was our approach. This is where about half of them under General Coffee went around the bend. This is where the Indians crossed the river, and so on. So they really are important when you take them in that light. I also include a lot of first-hand accounts of the battle. In fact, every one I could find. Some of them have been published previously, but I wanted people to be able to read them themselves and have these people identified. And I think when and there's a lot of repetition in those letters, but when you take them together with those maps, it really does provide a very powerful and new way to look at the building. And this is, the maps, this one in particularly, are really good at laying out the battle visually and pointing to the fact that the Red Sticks really were military engineers. They built an incredible series of fortifications that held off one of the largest American armies of the day for a good long while, and it was only a two-pronged attack that made it possible for the Americans to win. And this little map that Colonel Carroll provided even has temporal data. In other words, at 10 o'clock we were here, at 12 o'clock this happens. And so it goes on to provide incredible details of what was happening, and I think really makes the battle more powerful by showing us this visual evidence. Finding the barricade is one of the most important historical question, and the three maps I mentioned originally, the so-called Coffee, now cataloged as the Tarrant map, the Jackson map, and Cheatham's map, have been used repeatedly by archaeologists in an attempt to locate the barricade. This line you see at the top there is the current representation of the barricade at the park, which, as you see, is nowhere near where any of these other maps, and it's very complex how they did this, and I do discuss it in the book. But it's, these maps have been used by archaeologists in an attempt to locate the barricade and describe it. And my point is, if they'd had all these other maps, it would have been a lot more helpful, and a better understanding of the maps. It would have been a lot more helpful in locating the digs to start with. And due to things like ground penetrating radar, they have a much better fix. And what we now know is that unlike the map, the line here, which basically shows just a row of posts that shows the barricade ending in a big hole, that's not where it was. It would have been further up the hill, which means the Americans really had to work a lot harder to get up that hill to then face a wall. In other words, they weren't coming down on it. So it really provides a layout on the barricade and red stick defenses that I think are very important. More importantly, it provides information that should be the first question we ask. What in the world were they doing building that big barricade there? What was it all for? Why did they fight so hard? And the answer is simple. It protected a refugee village. One of the maps even has 300 houses, and they weren't teepees. They were probably log cabins, which the Greeks had moved to by then. But it housed a substantial number of women and children, and they are not mentioned very much or at all in these letters. But there were substantial numbers of women and children, and many of them lost their lives in that battle. They were just casualties of the conflict going on around them. But that explains what the Creeks were doing. They had built what they thought, which indeed it was, a heavily fortified position to protect non-combatants from 6 different villages. Some of the women, I know, were evacuated before the building, but the Americans got there really fast, surrounded the river, and evacuation of all the non-combatants became impossible, and so they were all trapped in this bend. But that is why the battle took place where it did. And on that Carroll map, General Carroll's map, he wrote a notation, or there is a notation on the back of the map that flips over to the front. And according to him, he's giving a description of the casualties. The hostile Indians, 557 killed, and then continued on the face of the map, too many of their women and children. And they didn't count the women and children for, I think, a couple of obvious reasons. One, you don't want that in your record, and two, they were in a hurry to get out of there, fearing another attack. And let me just say something about the 557. Those were 557 on the battlefield, and I think I've already said this. They didn't count the ones who were floating in the river. As at least 2 of the men said, a river that might truly be called a river of blood, because that's where the wounded crept to. That's where people trying to escape the battle, and they were just floating and washing along the shores. So conservative estimates are about at least 800 Red Sticks dead. Andrew Jackson thought from his intelligence there were about 1,000 people at the bend, so that would make sense in that. So the maps are really important in focusing on that aspect of the battle. It's a defensive battle. The Americans are actually the attackers, and they are the aggressors here against a civilian population. Regarding memorialization and memorializing sacrifice, on the Jackson map, the only individual's name who appears in any kind of memorial sense, other than, Coffee's brigade went here, that's not really memorializing Coffee, that's just giving you information, is this absolutely incredible notation. Here you see marked by 0, that angle at which Montgomery fell. General Lemuel Montgomery, for whom Montgomery County is named, was the highest ranking officer who lost his life that day. And his death dominated accounts of the battle for years to come. Albert J. Pickett, one of Alabama's earliest and probably best known historian, even declared that he was the most handsome man in the Army, this beautiful, rich man, robust in his life, and he gave his life for his country the historian wrote, waving his sword over his head and urging his men on. Well, poor Lemuel Montgomery did lose his life, but he found it when he poked his head in a porthole and was shot in the head. It wasn't gloriously waving his officer's sword. But Montgomery, if you go to the battle site, his grave is there. He was, and this is a funny story, he was buried on the battlefield that day, the only one of the Americans buried on the battlefield. He was later moved after Alabama became a state to another location that was out of Creek territory. That was still Creek territory until the 1830s. And then after Alabama became a state, another burial expedition was sent to move him back to the park after it became a national park. So poor Lemuel Montgomery has been buried a number of times. And you can still see his headstone at the park, and he is still the focus of patriotic ceremonies and so forth. And so this notion of patriotism, of heroic sacrifice and giving your life for your country, which we all appreciate, has become one of the dominant themes of Horseshoe Bend interpretation, for better or for worse. And I will say this, and I do have a picture. I looked hard, very hard, for a number of years to find a red stick in a museum collection, that iconic weapon, the symbol of war for the Muskogee Creek Indians. I could not find one. It doesn't surprise me that Tennessee owns Montgomery's sword, and the National Museum, Smithsonian, owns one of his pistols. And so, it's a very powerful thing that the man's death is used as a way to promote memorial, to promote sacrifice and so on. And I have a section in the book about that. And then the other section are all those documents. And one of the most interesting things, here's a much maligned figure in Alabama history, Major William McIntosh, who was a Coweta Indian. He was the highest-ranking Creek Indian at the battle, who was fighting with the Americans. He was an allied Creek, and he and his men crossed the river. And to their credit, he and his men, Creeks, were mainly busy trying to rescue Creek women who the Cherokee contingent of the American Army were busy trying to capture and enslave. And they did make off with substantial numbers of women. But McIntosh rounded up many of them, and to his credit, Jackson had McIntosh escort them to Huntsville with instructions they be put under guard and provided for necessities and not be harmed by any of the local inhabitants. But it was McIntosh, in his capacity as on this expedition for Jackson to carry these women to safety, also carried, as you see here, a hasty account of my incidents and result of my expedition to the Tallapoosa. So William McIntosh performed that service and carried many of these maps. And I will say this, I have, those documents are one of my favorite parts of the book, along with the maps, because I think they will be a good source for students and anyone interested in the battle. And I'm very happy that after those maps had been on my desk and bothering me in my head, that I was eventually able to get them published in a book in a format so that others could study them and perhaps gain new insights as I have as well. And I want to conclude just by reading you a short paragraph, maybe 2 paragraphs. The battle at Horseshoe Bend was a signal American victory and a crushing blow to the Creek people. It was also a complete and total victory that transformed the mental image of the American people. The Creeks, in defeat, disappeared from both mind and map to be replaced by a celebration of sacrifice, military strength, and American dominance. The maps of the victors are testimony to this point of view. Some were clearly designed to be presentation items for fellow officers, friends, or families, while others were hasty sketches done in a way to relate the news to those back home. The maps are souvenirs for men of certain social standing and rank, meant to memorialize gallantry, duty, service, and blood sacrifice. The maps represent the sense of pride that the officers felt in their achievement in arms, as well as their role in this momentous battle. American soldiers produced visual representation of the battle as a way to explain and commemorate their victory and celebrate success. Their maps were preserved, shared, and widely printed in newspapers, magazines, and books. In our own day, archaeologists have used the battlefield maps in attempts to locate the actual site of the barricade. The maps reveal the mindset of the victors and the manner in which the American Army achieved total victory. They are war memorials, celebrations of conquest. More importantly, and I want you to go away with this notion, the maps are essential to explaining the Red Stick side of the story. American maps highlight the fact that Red Stick defensive strategy centered on protection of their civilian population against an invasion force tasked with the total destruction of Creek towns and population. And of the 62-odd Creek towns, virtually every one in the Upper Creek Nation was burned and destroyed. Cattle were taken away by the Army. The total wealth of the Upper Creek Nation was destroyed by this war. The maps explain not only how the American battle plan unfolded, but how Red Stick aims shaped the kind of battle it was, why it took place where it did, and why the defenders fought valiantly to the last man. They were fighting to save their families. Thank you.
Do you have time for some questions?
Certainly I do.
Okay. If you have a question, if you don't mind, Dr. Braun, if you'll repeat the question so that we get it on the audio, on the video.
I will.
Okay. Does anybody have a question?
Yes.
There is a reenactment of the battle, March 22nd.
Yes, the question is about a reenactment of the battle on March 22nd. It is actually not a reenactment. It's more properly a commemoration, and there will be, it is on Saturday, March 22nd, right? We can look that up. Yeah, it will, the 22nd, which is, and it's always held the Saturday closest to the 27th, which was the day of the actual battle. And there are a cannon crew, an American cannon crew there. There will be other living history people showing camp life, different things. And it happens every year, and I hope you can all go out. If you're on Facebook, you can look at at the Park Service page, or look for Friends of Horseshoe Bend, or call the park, and you can get all the details, because usually they do the cannon firing at specific times, and they'll tell you which living history camps will be there. But thank you for pointing that out.
Did the soldiers have flintlocks or percussion rifles? And was the Indians armed with rifles? Or did they use a bow and arrow?
Yes to all the above. Yes to all the above. The Americans weren't as well supplied as one would think. In some cases, you had to bring your own equipment, but they did do a pretty good job, and they were, if you go to the commemoration, you can see how they had to load those rifles, and it was not easy, and it was not fast. But yes, they had those, and then they had the cannon, which mainly made a lot of noise, smoke, and did kill some people, but not very effectively. Yes, they were. And one of the documents that I've included in the book details very well the variety of weapons they had. The early notion was that the Red Sticks threw away all the things they'd gotten from an American because of a religious revivalism. That is about as far from the case as you can get. They did use traditional weapons, but in a close combat situation like this, a bow and arrow is not very helpful. Like all men of all ages across the world, they wanted the best technological weapon they could get, and the musket or rifle was that. And one of the ways that myself and one of my students were able to definitively say that there were rifles there, besides the fact the archaeologists have found the balls and can tell you, more particulars, is that a lot of people, Americans and Cherokees, were wounded during this battle, and eventually Congress, thankfully many years later, allowed these so-called invalids to apply for aid for their country for becoming wounded in the service, wounded war veterans. And to get this pension, you had to have the signature, in many cases, of an examining physician, statements from your superior officers, and that sort of thing. And then you had to have a detailed statement about what you were doing, when you enlisted, what you were doing, how you were wounded. And so these provide really incredibly good insight into what was going on in the battle as well. And my student Susan Abram, who published a wonderful book on Cherokee participation in the war, examined all the invalid files from the Cherokees. I looked at every one I could find from the American side, and every one of them is shot with a rifle. And it usually says a rifle. And these are people who would know. And but most importantly, they also had knives, hatchets, and they had war clubs. And after you fired your musket, and somebody's coming up on you, you don't have time to sit there and, put the flint in. You then grab the war club, and that's a close contact weapon. And so the answer is yes, they were using traditional weapons and rifles. And Andrew Jackson was almost shot at the battle. I mean, they narrowly missed killing him when he went with an interpreter to ask a group of men who were in a forward-facing position, saying, "You're not going to get out of here alive. Why don't you just go ahead and surrender?" And the answer to that question was they shot off a load of rifle shot, and the interpreter was injured, but it hit a tree, a black oak tree, instead of Jackson. So, but yes, they were very well armed. Yes, sir.
Kathryn, I like your feeling of you mentioned the Cherokee, and later, I don't know this for a fact, but I've always heard that Andrew Jackson even sent them to Oklahoma, even the ones that had helped him in the Horseshoe Bend and the Friendly Creeks. That he didn't distinguish between who went on the Trail of Tears. That they all did.
No, they all did, and the Cherokee and the Choctaws worked with the Mississippi Territorial Militia at some of the battles that they were involved in. And those men, including the Friendly Creeks, William McIntosh, all the Americans called them Friendly. They were the National Council Creeks who had been attacked by the Red Sticks in the beginning. They all were looking at a new view of military service. We think of Native Americans with a bow and arrow and this sort of thing. But since the 18th century, they'd been handling firearms and so forth. And they were looking at new ways of military organization in the same way with companies and officers and drills and that kind of a new kind of warfare that very well suited their martial culture. But the Cherokees in particular viewed this as a way to show the Americans, we're going to go fight with you because we are your allies, we value your friendship, see, we're helping you for all the good that eventually does them. And keep in mind, what's often forgotten is that the war is started as a civil war, and the reasons the Americans get involved, besides the fact they were looking for a way to get involved, is that the National Council Creeks said, we need help in putting down this insurgency. And that's what happened. So, but the treaties of removal came much later and involved some individuals were exempt. Very famously, if you had fought in the war with the Americans, you were given property if it was in the land that was ceded. And that is how the Porch Band Creeks got their land, because they were given, some of those men who fought with the Americans were given small land grants under the Treaty of Fort Jackson in return for military service, since the treaty of many millions of acres meant that they lost their towns and their property. So, but yes, those removal treaties did not discriminate. And I want to also say it's not just Andrew Jackson, it's the people of the southern states, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, who really wanted to have the Indians removed, to destroy tribal sovereignty, to end these enclaves of Indian land, but they also wanted people who were ethnically different out of the way. it was ethnically and race-based removal as well as grabbing the land. There's just no way to sugarcoat that. You can read published documents in newspapers, and that's pretty clear. Yes, sir. No. Altogether, he, pardon? Oh, sorry, thank you. The question, thank you for telling me that. The question was this the battle at which Jackson adopted an Indian boy? As far as we know, no. And Jackson did adopt, over the course of the war, 3, using the word adopt loosely. 2 of them died pretty young. 1 lived to be a teenager and did live in the household because Jackson wrote home to his wife and said, keep him in the house, yeah, which tells you what Rachel might have done otherwise. And but this was not an uncommon practice. There were several children who were taken by officers from Horseshoe Bend that either got separated from their parents or who were orphaned. This happened not only at Horseshoe Bend but at other Creek War battles. They're known as pets, and so they're taken home and raised with the families. In some cases, we're not really sure of the status. Some of them obviously adopted into families. Some of them maybe into slavery. The Cherokees took quite a number of women and children. There's one of the few and famous references to this Cherokee man who shows up at home with a Creek woman and her child, and the Cherokee wife is not too happy. And the woman manages to escape and get back home, but she can't get her child out. So it was very devastating on a human and personal level for all these people who were captured or enslaved or made refugees or left basically in a country without a house to live in or a way to eat in March without any seed corn or anything. It was pretty bad. There's another question back here. Yes, ma'am. It is several months. It was in late 1813, and one of the things that was a lucky time. That when we have one map for that battle that was later published. Don't have the manuscript map per se, but Jackson's army came down in November, and the first thing they started doing was burning isolated villages and households. And in fact, that's where he got the first pet and shipped these people back, the Indians back to Tennessee as prisoners and so forth. But his army was sort of not well supplied and not many of them, and he suffered by the end of 1813 and early in 1814 some really near disasters, and so sent men recruiting back in Tennessee, and I think that's where the Creeks miscalculated at Horseshoe Bend, because by the time they got back to the Creek Nation in the spring, early spring of 1814, he had raised a substantial force of in excess of 3,000. He took about 3,000 men with him down to Horseshoe Bend, and that was an unprecedented number. They had not had that many before. Yes, ma'am. Oh, okay, thank you. I'm looking the wrong way. Yes, ma'am.
When you were talking about the fortification,
Yeah.
you said that there was kind of a break
Yeah.
in it, and I can't remember what you called it. The only thing I can think of is salad fork, and that wasn't what you called it.
Sally. So you sally forth. It's a sally port. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry about that. Having trouble with my microphone here. Yes, ma'am. No, I don't, but I'd like to talk to you about it. Yeah. The comment was that her grandparents, and this was when it became, worked at Horseshoe Bend, and this was when it was first opened in the 1960s as a military park, yeah. And the story of the creation of that park is incredible in itself because the locals around the park, as well as like-minded history nuts around the state, had to work long and hard to get that created as a national park. And it's something we should all value and be careful to protect. And in the National Park Service scheme of things, we have national parks and national this, national that. A national military park is the highest sort of, I won't say honor, but it's the most meaningful one because it is a military park. It's a memorialization in itself for the men who lost their lives there. Yes, sir.
Jack Coley should deserve a lot of credit for it.
Yes.
His aim in life to make it.
Right. This gentleman is saying Judge Jack Coley was instrumental in that, and indeed he was, and he labored long and hard, and as did his son as a supporter once it was created. And I got to meet Judge Coley very near the end of his life, and I knew his son Jack. But that it really shows the power of individuals in a community if they come together and work with people statewide and really organize and get busy, what you can do. And it took a lot. And one of the things they had to do to make it a national park was to prove that it had national significance. Well, it does, but in the 1940s and 50s when they started, it was just an Indian battle off in Alabama, but it obviously had national significance. And so we're very fortunate to have that park and have that space preserved. And even when Martin Dam was being considered, the people who were involved in the building of Martin Dam understood the significance and made sure that that site was not flooded when the planning was done for how tall and how big the flooding would go. They, Martin and so forth, they were big supporters of this effort for a national park. Any other questions? No hard questions? Oh, gosh, I opened it up.
What were not some of the refugees at Horseshoe been, wasn't they from the little village of Hillamy?
Yes. The question is, weren't some of the people at Horseshoe Bend from Hillaby? Yes. What was left of the people of Hillaby? New York is all of these, well, Hillaby isn't, but New York was a village of the Okfuskee town, and it was just across the river from the toe of the bend. And it had been burnt by a contingent of Georgians in late 1813. And so those people from New York were there. Hillaby was there, Ukchai, the fish ponds, and people from the town of Eufaula, and Great Eufaula. It's under the lake right now. When you say the Eufaula town of the Creek Indians, people in our generation think way down there on the Chattahoochee, but it's not. Eufaula was a pretty sizable Indian town, and it's now buried under the lake like Okfuskee is. And New York is Alabama Power still owns part of New York. Part of it is on park property.
Well, I've always heard that they don't know exactly where Hillaby Town was.
That's true. The question is, I don't exactly know where Hillaby Town does. I have a friend who thinks he does because, you know what? He studied topo maps and descriptions, and we think we can figure it out. Yeah, a lot of people thought they knew, but yeah, it hasn't been located specifically and archaeologically in a meaningful way. A lot of creek towns are in that sort of shape. Yes, ma'am. Lake Martin. It was on the Tallapoosa River. Eufaula on the Tallapoosa. And so there becomes a lesser Eufaula later on, down on the Chattahoochee. Yeah, it probably is, because that was Lower Creek territory. I don't know if they still have it. The question was, there are some association down in Eufaula, Alabama with the Creek Indians. It was Creek territory. And one of the very important Creek leaders in the post-war period was Yaholamiko, and his portrait was painted in 1825, and it's an absolute astounding portrait. It's very nice, and the people of Eufaula, Alabama, claim it and put it on their hiking trail, but Yaholamiko was from Great Eufaula on the Tallapoosa. So I don't know if we want to tell the people in Eufaula, Alabama that or not, but they've got a Tallapoosa Indian down there. Yes, sir.
I saw a story recently about the need to translate all this longhand script for people who no longer know how to read that. Everybody do that with students?
Yes, I do. I had a lot of fun with students doing that. And that's one reason I've transcribed documents. I must say I didn't do it on purpose, but I did use a lot of primary documentation in my Southeastern Indian classes, American Revolution and colonial classes too. And there are some differences in handwriting in the 18th and 19th century and now, and I sometimes would forget to tell my students, even in printed works, about the long S, which is actually an F, and to hear them read that, and then I'm sorry, I forgot to tell you. But it really is shocking how many of the students do not write in longhand, which means they can't write essays very well because they're printing and it takes longer, but they also have a great deal of trouble reading it. And I will say, and you probably know, a lot of people don't have great handwriting, but if you don't get used to it and practice it and understand the variation in what letters look like, you are functionally illiterate when it comes to longhand. And a lot of our students, in my experience, they just can't read historical documents, which is a kind of surprising shame, really. Any other questions?
Any more questions?
One more?
If y'all were trying to stump her with your questions, you didn't succeed. That's why she's the best, and we appreciate
okay.
you so
Thank you
much,
so
Dr.
much.
Braund. I say this every time, but it's just so nice to have a speaker, a presenter that knows their subject matter so well. You can ask them anything, and I just appreciate you so much for being the expert and for always being a friend to the library. I believe, I want to make one point. She made the point in here to donate your papers, and you just heard her tell her whole investigative process, how she found these maps and the letters and the documents and things like that. I can guarantee you everybody in here has probably got something in an attic, in a box that belonged to somebody in your family that's a story that's worth telling. It's a document that maybe you don't want to give it to us, but maybe you'll bring it by and let us digitize it and make a copy of it so that when somebody like Dr. Braund is researching history, we have those documents here. So I encourage you to do that. The other thing is if they have a story, I know she mentioned she wanted to speak with somebody. If you have a story that you think is interesting, get in touch with us and let us know, because we have a video camera. We can sit down and talk with you and video your story, and one day it may be something that's included in a book or in a documentary of some sort. So thank you for highlighting the need for those stories.
Line now? Yeah. One more thing, one of my very dear neighbors passed away, and his wife was functionally blind, and he had been a great photographer, and she said, what can we do with these? And I started looking through those photos, and he was a Korean war vet, a very heroic one. He was wounded in action and drug men to safety and that sort of thing. But before that unfortunate thing happened, he had taken a lot of photographs of the camp he was at and daily life of these Korean war soldiers who were over there. And I said, well, I know what we're going to do with these. These go to the Alabama archives because they really detail what life was like for the average soldier. So when you're thinking about your family's papers, don't forget the photographs. And houses burn, hurricanes and tornadoes come through, children get crayons. So let them be digitized and save them and pass them along, because, valuable things like letters between your parents or grandparents during the war. I don't know what we're going to do, save emails now, I guess, but think about those things, and the libraries are here to help you preserve those kinds of materials.
Thank you. And I do want to say, I think you have 2 books with you for sale. And one has already been claimed in the back of the room back here. So I was just asked about that one. So I think she might have, the other one may have just been claimed. But can you tell them how to get a copy?
Right, well, I have 3, and they're available through Amazon or from Barnes & Noble's website. There are copies for sale at Horseshoe Bend, I think. They still have them there. And obviously from places like Amazon.com, or any local bookseller can order one for you.
Okay, thank you so much. And I do want to remind you, next week we have Mike Bunn that'll be with us. He's been with us before. He is another presenter like this. You can ask him anything and he can answer your questions. So he's going to talk about antebellum Mobile, and I thought, how timely with Mardi Gras coming up. That's a pretty timely subject. So he will be here. I want to say again, I just want to reinforce what Dr. Ted said. We are so appreciative of First Bank of Alabama and Chad Jones for sponsoring this series, Mr. Chris for always being here, and Miss Jane being such a good cookie girl over there, and to the Coosa Valley Medical Center for always providing us with such good treats. Thank you all so much for coming out today, because if you didn't show up, our presenters wouldn't show up. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. The program is recorded. She was asking how could somebody watch this if they wanted to see it. The program is recorded and it'll be on our YouTube page, Sam. The link will be on the library's YouTube page. So do it. And Facebook. So Sarah's got it on Facebook too. So you can find it both ways. Okay. All right. Thank you all so much for being here. Dr. Braun, thank you as well.